while everyone here is sitting down, thank you also from my side, Nanette, so much. I think we can pick up on your keynote in a very good way. And I want to welcome you all to this panel, No Democratizing Without Decolonizing, Intervening Museum Practices, Intervening in Museum Practices, to which we have all been looking forward very much. And please join me in welcoming warmly the three panelists, Marit Ifeoma-Kupka, Imara Limon, and Sandra Yeman. Yes. Museums are challenged to critically reflect on colonial knowledge orders that are inscribed into their collections, and even more so, that are oftentimes at the very foundation of their institutional being. Nanette Snoep has talked about this at length just now, and I myself am speaking here coming from the same institutional context, the ethnological museums in Saxony, to which you have referred several times. Yet, of course, and this has been brought up as well, the coloniality of the collections institutions doesn't count only for ethnographic museums, but for many other museum types and genres. In our first panel on Thursday, David Lord Kipanidze referred to archaeology as an historically colonial discipline. Other museums like natural history museums, university museums, the field of art museums, city museums are increasingly challenged to reflect on their histories of colonialism, on the colonial regimes that are inscribed into their collections. They are challenged, or I should rather say we are challenged, to reflect on and dismantle notions of cultural superiority, of white supremacy, on the history of exclusionary politics that still bear their effects until the very day of today, including who is coming to the museums and who is not, who is coming to work in the museums and who is not, who feels comfortable and who doesn't. It needs to be said, of course, that this process of reflection rarely comes out of the museums themselves, but from long-lasting political activism, from decades of post-colonial critique, from repeated interventions in museum practice, but also from the critical practice of people inside museums. Hence also the in brackets in the title. And we will be hearing about several examples of this important work in the presentations that follow. We have been talking a lot in the past days about the role museums can take in the never-ending process of democratization, in the efforts of democratizing democracy, as Jette Sandal has mentioned in her introductory remarks to the conference yesterday, and also in being empowering places that take a stand against attacks on democratic structures and principles. But how can we attend critically to the coloniality of the museums? What do we need to engage in on a structural level to engage in new narratives? And how can we make silencers speak, as Nanette has just formulated it? How can we reflect upon and disrupt discriminatory structures, both inside the institution, but also in the broader sense? And I'm thinking here about a very practical issue that comes up so often when you want to engage in transnational collaboration, and this may be an experience some of you share, when you invite partners from the so-called Global South and they are just restricted of coming because they're being denied their visa. So it is also the reality of the global border regimes that manifest on a daily basis, and this is regardless of the museum type we are working in. I think we can all agree that these issues also need to be addressed, especially when we talk about democratization and urgent challenges, and this is also why I have been hearing from so many that you're looking forward to this panel and to hear the three of you speak today. So let us pick up on the notion of staying with the trouble. And again, a very warm welcome to the three of you. Before I introduce the first speaker, Sandra Yeman, I wanted to just remark quickly how we have been thinking of organizing this panel. As the sound situation on stage sometimes is difficult for those sitting on stage and listening to the person standing here, those of us who are not speaking will be sitting in the first row. And after the three presentations, which will be approximately 15 minutes each, we will all come up back on stage. So just so you're not wondering why everybody's leaving right away. So let me start with introducing Sandra Yeaman. Sandra has been the curator of discomfort at the Hunterian at the University of Glasgow since 2021. She has a background in anti-racist activism in Scotland, working for social justice and equality for many years. The Hunterians' Curating Discomfort project was devised to challenge historical power dynamics and, through uncomfortable processes, empower new forms of collaboration between community groups, museum professionals, and academics. It has become such an international recognition that a new project was shaped with the title Power in This Place, Unfinished Conversations, which has started last year and is lasting until 2025. And I think this is only the project-based time, because it will spark developments that won't end in 2025, which seeks to develop further the process of change at the Hunterian. And we'll be hearing more about this now, to which I'm very much looking forward to. So welcome, Sandra.
I'm so small. Is that okay? Can you all hear at the back? I will try my best to speak slowly, because I'm sure for many of you, hearing a Scottish Glasgow accent will be quite unusual. And as Fred said, you know, I am the curator of discomfort, so if you do feel uncomfortable, that's okay. That's my job. We always have to feel uncomfortable before we actually enable growth. So please keep that in your mind. And I think it was really important what Fred said about activism, because one of the reasons we are all here and having these conversations is it came from the community, the grassroots movement, and went into the spaces of the museums. And it's great to see some of the changes that people are working on today, in present day. But I first want to thank EMYA for inviting me on this platform with distinguished speakers as Fred, Imara and Mariet, so thank you for that. And also, in the spirit of transparency, I have really seen museums being represented that go from the downright bizarre to those that attempt to centre community in all that they do. And I do think it's a testament to the museum world when their estate institutions want to become part of that. And just to position myself, so I was born in Glasgow in the 60s. Father came to Glasgow in 1963 from the Indian Punjab. My great-grandfather came from Ireland in the 1800s. So you can see the complexity of my own heritage, my own cultural heritage. And I should also position the fact that in Scotland, culture is a devolved matter, so it is not the business of the Westminster government. And that's been important for us in our activism, because we have been pushing this agenda for more than 20 years, and we do have more or less backing in this area. So currently the Scottish Government has had recommendations through projects work that we've done where all museums across Scotland have to talk about and include the histories of the people who have been impacted most by empire, colonialism, slavery, and migration. And also as part of my positioning is museums have always been seen as institutions that preserve and present the cultural heritage of humanity. However, they have an equally important role in addressing the challenges and issues that confront our society today. And a big part of my work as curator of discomfort really is about building a bridge of trust between activists, social justice campaigners, communities, and academics and museum professionals. So to properly begin, the Hunterian is the oldest public museum in Scotland, 1807, and one of the oldest Scottish universities, 1451. Now, in 2018, the University of Glasgow published the report titled Slavery, Abolition and the University of Glasgow. Now, this report acknowledged that despite a strong abolitionist stance in the 18th and 19th centuries, the university continued to further its institutional goals through the acceptance of gifts and bequests from people who profited from chattel slavery, from people who profited from the enslavement of African people. Now, in response to this, the Hunterian developed Creating Discomfort, a project to explore the interpretation of contested collections and to find new forms of collaboration between the museum, academics, and the wider Glasgow community. Now, the work of Creating Discomfort not only produced a visible public-facing output, because what do museums do? They love to do outputs, exhibitions, but also an exploration of the ideologies that perpetuate the inequalities and prejudices that persist today. And this is most notable in relation to Black and other racialized peoples who are those most impacted by the legacies of empire, slavery, colonialism, and migration. So we have an image here, image credit to Sharon Heal, I might add, of the community creators winning the Reimagining Museum Award in 2022. So you'll see from your right? You have Mungo, the deputy director, we have Mary, we have Yvonne, we have Ezra, there is me, we have Arunima, and we have Nelson. One of our colleagues, Chunji, couldn't make the event, and then you have the director, Steph, at the end. And the Creating Discomfort, the motivation for Creating Discomfort really draws on the evidence and experience of inequality and racism in Scotland. So while I'm talking about the experience in Scotland, I really hope that you can identify with your own experience in the time and space and place that you are living in and working in. And in Scotland, this personal and specific historical context belonging to people of African, Caribbean, and Asian descent link them to the legacies of empire, transatlantic slavery, colonialism, and migration. Now, each of these injustices has had an extensive impact on Scotland's economic, demographic, environmental, cultural, and social development. Now, despite this, the histories of these communities are not acknowledged and represented as well as they should be within history, heritage, arts, and culture work in Scotland today. And it was for that reason we brought together a group of community creators who didn't know each other, who come from various geographical backgrounds, who all have interests in different areas, and we formed a community for 6 months. But I'm not going to talk about the community element of Creating Discomfort. What I want to talk about is I want to share with you the interventionist process undertaken at the Hunterian before the public-facing output that is currently situated in the museum. So we spent a year doing work before we invited any collaboration, co-production, and co-creation. So the motivation. Museums hold collections that have a direct link to the history of African, Caribbean, and Asian people, and yet they do not recognize or understand that legacy. So this is the motivation. Racism in Scotland is structural. This means it operates across different levels of life, personal, social, and institutional. And because of this, the impact of racism affects people across their life experiences. It affects working life, family life, friendships, and physical and mental health. Racism is unjust and should have no place in any society. And it's up to all of us to tackle it, but first we need to understand its impacts. And what I would put forward is you'll see a website on this slide, www.crer.org.uk. That is the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, which is a strategic anti-racist organisation in Scotland. I'm sure that you will have equivalents again, in the area, the time and space that you work in. And I would really recommend that you work with the local activist groups in your area. So while community engagement exercises within museums are welcome, there are issues of the lack of equity involved and the power relationships between museums and the community groups they work with. They are often set up as volunteer opportunities, creating a power dynamic which knowledge and experience are held by the museum professionals, while volunteers' knowledge and experience are just not that professional enough to recompense financially. And at times this can manifest as exploitation. And while community engagement projects can be valuable to those who participate, the lack of structural change within museums means that they can continue to institutionally ignore the integral role that empire has played in shaping their approaches to their history. Now, Creating Discomfort looked at what defines a community, and it ways outside of traditional structures of museum authority to challenge existing models of practice. And this was done in the hope of changing the power relationships between the museums and the communities that they're there to serve. And to explore the interpretation of contested collections, we set out to design and deliver a series of museum interventions that took the museum out of its institutional comfort zone. And at the center of this was exploring white supremacy as an economic and cultural system in which white Western ideas control the power of the text, the material resources, and the ideas of cultural superiority. Now, while current discourse in museums is looking at decolonization, what that means in practice goes far beyond a display. Discomfort is necessary for meaningful change. And to begin, we delivered workshops for museum professionals from across Scotland. We explored the concepts of different races and racial groups and the false notions of race and racial superiority that were developed during the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century. Now, these ideologies were used to justify chattel slavery, looting, and violent endeavours in the name of empire. We then explored structural racism in the present day, how false notions of racial and cultural superiority still have an influence in all areas of life in Scotland and across Europe, from ingrained social attitudes to the way organisations are run. Now, each permitting inequalities for Black and other racialised communities to continue over generations. It can be seen on a personal level in people's attitudes and behaviours, on a social level in how people talk to each other and make decisions, and on an institutional level in how organisations conduct their business. Now, most people recognise that racist attitudes and language are unacceptable. Nevertheless, many museums and Scotland museums are only now recognising they are not neutral, and that for years they have been complicit in perpetuating the ideologies of previous centuries, and that museums present a comfortable narrative about empire and history and have frequently omitted, in particular in Scotland, Scotland's complicity and direct involvement in chattel slavery and colonialism. And this can no longer be tolerated and must be dismantled. So through the workshops, we collectively listed how the past inequalities and ideologies exist today in the functions, in the theory, and in the practice of museums. And participants generated lists of current issues. For example, the majority of museum staff in Scotland are white European. The collections have been donated by people who generated their wealth through strong colonial links. Often, the knowledge and experience of Black and other racialised communities is either erased or ignored, while white people's voices are prioritised. And we recognise the privileged position of power that museums hold within society. And that because of that privileged position of power, we could therefore be a power for change. And we thought about what that change could look like, and we generated a list of practical steps to build equity. Now, this included the acknowledgement that racism is a legacy of empire, slavery, and colonialism, and sharing power with equity means we need to be honest and transparent, and we need to render a more truthful narrative of our history. So what I want to show you is a small animation that came out of those workshops that we delivered across Scotland. Now, these workshops were only delivered to the museum community, i.e. the museum professionals, the people who work in museums, from directors down to front of house, everyone who's involved in actually ensuring that museums function. Okay. Now, what's important for me to point out, those weren't my words. I just did the intervention, I imparted information, I talked about history. Those are museum professionals themselves that came up with all those ideas, so please be mindful of that. And also what I should say, if anybody's feeling uncomfortable, many white people are not used to being racialized, so I understand that discomfort, and just sit there, you'll be okay. So phase 2. Now remember, we hadn't worked with any external communities. Think about it, think about that internal work. Now phase 2, organizational change. Now, as part of the actions and practical steps for change from the workshops, we recognize that organizational change is required, and we acknowledge that the infrastructure must be in place if museums want to work with external community groups in a meaningful way. We developed a Creating Discomfort library for staff to reference when researching collections, as well as for continued professional development and anti-racist practice. And this is a mixture of academic historians' work, some critical race theory, but most importantly, oral history. written by specific people from diasporic communities, and they are in that library sharing the equity of the academic writings. But most importantly, we developed and published a new strategic plan for 2021-25, which emphasises moving towards becoming a more ethical museum that welcomes the knowledge and experience and perspective of communities to co-create with equity. Now, our core values are the driver to change, and this means we must look at new ways of organisational leadership that can articulate and communicate our ethical vision, and looking at ways to hold people accountable and put ethics above short-term interests. Now, recognising that driving change through management orientation with top-down decision-making will not get us to where we want to be. Only through the practice of co-production and collaboration, social responsibility, sustainable development, critical dialogue, and consensus-orientated decision-making will we be able to transform our processes and practice. Hear me, directors of the museums and senior managements here in this room today. Shifting the power and authority of the museum organisation to have critical dialogue that at times is uncomfortable, but at the foundation is driven with the self-confidence that we recognise what we are and working towards continued improvement. This work is not a project. A project has a beginning, a middle, and an end. This is not a project. This is ongoing and something we must embed in our practices and our organisations. Now, Creating Discomfort was a process, a beginning to develop a shared understanding of the impact museums have on wider society and their responsibility in perpetuating an ideology, consciously or not, of power inequalities. We developed a strategic plan, a way for self-reflection and identify what we stand for and what we want to become. We know that to do this work, there will be times that we will lose our way. However, having the self-confidence to acknowledge this, the ability to self-reflect, genuine humility, and recognising our strengths and weaknesses when this happens, we can build on this and stay focused on our continuous improvement. Now, I want to leave you with the first label that you would encounter if you ever get to come to Glasgow in Scotland. Come and see the intervention in the Hunterian Museum. This would be the first label that we'd see in the intervention. And I should also add, the animation that you saw is also in the museum space as part of the interventionist approach, and you have access to all of this on the Hunterian website. Please use and share widely in any way that you think it may be of help. So, a declaration of discomfort. Most museums are monuments to a system that privileges some people over others and creates a narrative about the identity of nations or cities that institutions seek to project and protect. Museums hold collections from donors who benefited from the practice of racial slavery, violent endeavours, forced removal, and the systematic oppression of Indigenous peoples. Museums are political places. Creating Discomfort puts forward discomforting provocations and interventions to help us to understand that museums have perpetuated ideologies of white supremacy, a political, economic, and cultural system in which white Western ideas control the power of the text, the material resources, and the actions that continue to underpin notions of cultural superiority. Colonial systems such as the British Empire used these ideologies to justify the enslavement and colonizations of peoples and lands around the world. Museums developed within this context, and they remain spaces that celebrate and memorialize colonial systems. Collections, displays, and labels are a political act that have legacies rooted in colonialism. We are only now recognizing that we are not neutral and that we have, without consideration, been complicit in perpetuating the ideologies of previous centuries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. And I know it's not so easy to not be able to ask questions right away, but please, please keep them in your mind for the discussion later on. May I just immediately go on with introducing Dr. Marit Ifeoma-Kupka to you. Marit is an art scholar, freelance writer, and since 2013, she's senior curator at the Museum Angewandte Kunst, Museum of Applied Arts in Frankfurt, Germany. In her exhibitions, publications, and interdisciplinary projects, she addresses the issues of racism, of memory culture, representation, and the decolonization of art and cultural practices in Europe and on the African continent. Since 2019, she has been part of the interdisciplinary event and exhibition series Talking Objects Lab, which explores new approaches in museums and exhibition practices and strategies of mediation. And I believe we will be hearing a little about this in a minute. She's a member of the advisory board of the Initiatives of Black People in Germany, ISD, and of Texte zur Kunst, and founding member of the Neue Deutsche MuseumsmacherInnen, a network of BIPOC museum practitioners and professionals in Germany. She studied economics in Heidelberg, as well as aesthetics, media theory, philosophy, curatorial practice, and exhibition design at the Karlsruhe University of Arts and Design, where in 2015 she received her doctorate in art and media theory. Please join me in welcoming Marit Ifeoma-Kupka.
Thank you very much for the introduction and also for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm here today speaking as a curator of the Museum Angewandte Kunst, though I've left the institution, and I mean this quite literally. I stepped outside the institution, the building, and into spaces, contexts where change happens already, and co-created the Talking Objects Lab, which I'm going to speak about today. And I have spoken about this over the last few years a lot. There's a lot of interest, which I'm sure has to do with the fact that it's very open, process-oriented project, and that we are dealing with a lot of issues that museums and collections and archives are facing today. The starting point of Talking Objects is, as we always say, the decolonization of memory and knowledge in Europe and on the African continent, and the ongoing debates on the so-called restitution of looted objects from colonial context. We wondered what the debates are really about, or more precisely, should be about. We, that is Isabel Rabe, freelance curator from Berlin, and an over the years well-grown curatorial team from Kenya and Senegal, hopefully Nigeria will join soon. I will come back to that later. The fact that Talking Objects is so open and process-oriented doesn't make it easy to explain what exactly it is all about, but I'll try, of course, anyway. So what do we do? The Talking Objects project can be split into three parts. First, the Talking Objects Lab, which unfolds over several years in symposia, artistic interventions, and exhibitions. The aim is to break down Eurocentric knowledge systems and to show the complexity and plurality of different forms of knowledge. Part of this are, for example, our unexpected lessons, and more about this later. As a digital archive for decolonial knowledge production, we are building the Talking Objects Archive based on a curated collection of objects from European and African museums. The archive will show pluralistic forms of knowledge and will make them accessible online. The Talking Objects think tanks are conferences where scholars, artists, and other experts are invited to engage discursively and artistically with the following questions. How can we decolonize knowledge? What should a decolonial digital archive look like? What does polyperspectivity mean? How can we make objects speak? And all three areas merge organically and feed into each other, and everything is documented on our blog. Thank you. As you see a screenshot here, and it's a blog website, and it is less about information than about documentation of our activities and to show how everything is always connected. Before I go further into the three topics I just presented, I would like to talk about the term decolonization as we understand it. Decolonization has become a kind of buzzword in recent years and always puts us a bit in an awkward position when we name our events, for example, decolonizing knowledge or decolonizing nature, decolonizing romantic, or decolonizing restitution, the most recent event in Lagos, Nigeria. I am planning another event on decolonizing decolonization soon. There is no single definition or description of what exactly is meant by decolonization. All those who talk about it mean roughly the same thing, but if you look more closely, there are certain inconsistencies. But an understanding of decolonization is problematic when it is seen as a promise to undo the colonial, as the prefix "de" implies. As if, for example, a museum collection can be cleansed of colonial entanglements by rephrasing labels or inviting artists and scholars from the so-called Global South to engage with the collection. In general, this is all good, but it can only be a beginning. For our understanding of the decolonial, a critical reflection on European modernism is central. We take a closer look at cultural phenomena such as science, art, or religion as parts of colonial rule. We are interested in alternative forms of knowledge, alternative narratives, and possible other futures. We develop strategies and practices to challenge and transform colonial structures and cultures. In short, it is not about developing final definitions, but about practicing dealing with a certain ambiguity. But what can these practices look like? Talking objects is continuation and process. It is not about organizing events or projects with a clear beginning and ending, but about developing results further, reflecting on mistakes, and developing organically. In June 2021, our launch event for the Talking Objects Lab took place simultaneously in Berlin and Nairobi. Unexpected Lessons, Decolonizing, Memory and Knowledge. A performative discussion festival hybrid. There were keynotes, panels, and artistic interventions. We had a film program and space for discussion and encounter for the corona-conditioned, unfortunately very limited number of audience on site. The conference can still be viewed online. The hybridity of the event allowed us to have Unexpected Lessons happen simultaneously in Berlin and Nairobi. So we tuned into Nairobi, they tuned into Berlin, which created a decentralization that laid the foundation for real encounters. In Nairobi, there are debates and arguments of their own, which we were able to attend, to participate in, instead of always inviting others to our debates. We understand decolonization as a shared challenge. Colonialism has inseparably linked Europe and Africa. Entangled history is a fact. Our great task is to confront it in all its complexity and racist exclusion mechanisms that are still effective today. In doing so, it is important to develop joint visions for possible futures that take into account the history of violence, but also emphasize positive aspects and create space for imagination and the previously unknown. Our second event in December 2021, Le Langage des Objets at the Musée Théodore Monod in Dakar, focused more clearly on the talking objects. Together with artists and experts from various disciplines, we gathered to discuss the identities of objects and the knowledge inherent in them. We asked ourselves, what knowledge is hidden in the things? What memories are archived in them? What do they have to tell us, and how can we make them speak? How do they acquire agency, outgrow the status of their objectification? We have long known that things can span a wide range of forms of being. They became objects and artifacts with the looting from their ancestral contexts, where they fulfilled very different functions. Thus, we are not interested in a mere exploration or restoration of old contexts and modes of use. We ask ourselves what role the objects can take on today, as agents of a colonial past and as mediators of a still unknown future. This was followed by the third event, Revisiter les Objets, in May 2022, and part of these collaborations with the Musée Théodore Monod are so-called artist residencies. And during the first residency in December 2021, the artist Villiers Dibat explored the language of materials and the knowledge hidden within them. During the second Talking Objects Lab residency, artist and photographer Ibrahima Thiam entered into a dialogue with drums from the museum's collection. He was interested in the language, rhythm, and sound of vibrating objects and sounds as a mediator between the visible and the invisible. During his residency, he created photographs that we showed as part of a lecture performance last May at the Dakar Biennale in the Pédagogique of the Musée Théodore Monod. And Henri Sagnat took the talking objects quite literally and connected microphones to selected objects to record their sound over a long period of time. He spent time with them, lived with them, and from this research, the artist developed a multimedia installation at the Musée Théodore Monod. And currently, Elise Fitt-Duval is working at the Théodore Monod, and what she says I have here in the presentation on wall, and due to the limited time, I won't read this out to you. Before I talk further about our upcoming program in Dakar and our future cooperation with the Museum Angewandte Kunst, I would like to talk a bit about the unexpected lessons. After our launch on decolonizing memory and knowledge, we were invited to Iceland to develop a program there, Unexpected Lessons to Decolonizing Nature. It was about, the title says it all, nature. And against the backdrop of Iceland, a place of longing for many, geologically highly interesting, an archive of the Earth's history, nature became the other object, based on the idea of an expanded concept of object. We asked ourselves, what makes nature the other? What role does the separation of nature and culture play in this? Is the culture-nature dichotomy tenable at all? And how can we decolonize our view of the world and think of nature differently? Last December, the Kunsthalle Osnabrück invited us to organize unexpected lessons on the theme of German Romanticism as part of its thematic focus. Awakening, nostalgia, nationalism, Orientalism, and the mystification of nature. How does the Europe of Romanticism view the world? And how does Romanticism shape Europe's self-image today? We took a critical decolonial look at the ambivalent world of ideas of German Romanticism, which, as an artistic and political movement, still has a great influence on ideas of national European identity and belonging. Through talks, lectures, artistic interventions, film and music, we addressed the question of how colonial and romantic ideas are related. We worked our way to the roots of today's Europe as a cultural space, looked at Enlightenment and anti-Enlightenment, the history of Sinti and Romnia between romanticization and othering, and we talked about romantic love and power. January and February, I was on a residency in Lagos, Nigeria, as part of the Turn 2 Fund of the Federal Cultural Foundation Germany, and I was interested in the discussions around restitution in Nigeria, especially in the context of the Benin bronzes. At the end of the residency, I invited all my new contacts to another edition of Unexpected Lessons on the theme of decolonizing restitution, and we asked ourselves, what does restitution mean beyond the return of looted artifacts? Do we need to decolonize European notions of restitution? Into what context do the objects return? How can the objects be reintegrated into communities, and how do they withstand the ethnological gaze? What kind of museums are needed? What kind of spaces for imagining possible futures? In what ways can communities be involved in this process? What is needed to make the debate more accessible? And we also ask, what role do international NGOs play in this process? How important is cooperation between institutions within Nigeria and beyond? How can debates from other African countries be brought into Nigerian discussions? And what role does the diaspora play? And the video documentation is also available on our website. And in a few weeks, our workshop Réimaginer le passé, Reimagining the Past, will take place in Dakar. It takes the imaginary as a starting point to rethink realities. We want to imagine a future from a pre-colonial perspective in order to open up the possibility of alternative knowledge, narratives, and ways of thinking. We will do this together with artists and scholars from the African continent, the diaspora, and Europe. And Réimaginer le passé consists of a laboratory and exhibition project. We are a German-Senegalese curatorial team consisting of El Haj Malik Ndiaye, Isabel Rabe, Ibu Diop, and myself. We want to experiment in lectures, workshops, and artistic interventions and develop media and formats with the invited participants, which in turn will lead to exhibitions at the Musée Theodor Monod, at the Kindle Center for Contemporary Art in Berlin, and the Museum Angewandte Kunst. And speaking of Museum Angewandte Kunst, which is currently in the process of digitalization of its collections, Talking Objects is supporting the process, starting with the objects from the permanent collections, the so-called Elementarteile, like elementary parts. The first step is to rewrite object text and to develop ideas for the online presentation. We are developing a set of tools that help to rethink museum, exhibition, and collection practice, and thus by no means concerns ethnological museums alone, as you can see. And before I close, one last very important thing. We heard about it a bit before. Then speaking about all these great outcomes of these projects, it is easy to forget that the project of decolonization cannot be limited to the content, but must take into account the conditions in which these projects are embedded. And after our event in Iceland, we had a crisis meeting with our Kenyan project partners, and I'm talking about this to make difficult processes visible, which are probably not evident to most visitors of such events. Even organizers of these transcontinental projects have not yet fully taken these issues into account or considered them in their calculations. These are psychological and physical and often also monetary costs, which are mostly borne by the partners and guests of the, in our case, African continent. The crisis meeting was about visa politics and cultural sensitivity. And we were a team of 4 curators, 2 of them with EU passports and 2 with passports from Kenya who needed a visa to enter Iceland. 9 people were invited as guests of our on-site program, 2 of whom needed visas. The others were either Icelanders or had EU passports. 1 person who had been living and working in Berlin for years happened to obtain permanent residency status in time after years of struggle. One of our curatorial team was lucky enough to have a still valid 1-year multiple entry visa, which she had due to several projects in Germany. Meaning 3 people had to apply for a visa for Iceland at the Danish embassy in Kenya, which, it turned out, only in the process requires even more specific documents than a standard Schengen visa, for example, a police clearance certificate. A visa practice that puts our guests quite fundamentally under suspicion of illegality is necessarily also part of our discussion. One guest received her visa 1 week before departure. One participant received it so late that the flight had to be rebooked very expensively and inconveniently with a long layover, etc. And after we discussed whether it would be worth coming at all. One curator of the event did not get her visa at all and had to participate via Zoom. And you can find loads of reports on dehumanizing border policies online, and we also must talk about this when we talk about restitution. African artifacts are welcome, but not the people who created them. While Iceland is a dream destination for many, for others it can easily turn into a nightmare. For example, our guests reported uneasy feelings on the way to the supermarket. They felt reminded of Scandinavian crime stories. Iceland may be statistically one of the safest countries in the world, but for whom? The deserted streets at night may not deliver the feeling. Emotions reinforced by the hypervisibility of black bodies in majority white spaces. We all know how a group of black people is being perceived in that context. We all do. For hosts, these facts must also be taken into account. Who is invited and why? Does the requested knowledge simply serve to educate oneself, or is a space created for exchange and encounter? It is not the responsibility of those who are affected by it to raise awareness or even to change these details, which do, however, make a significant difference. But we need the information about them because those who do not have to make these experiences often do not even imagine what this means. It is important to me that this is also talked about in a lecture on decolonization. The journey starts with extending an invitation. How can we make sure that our guests really have everything they need to feel welcome, safe, and taken care of? Distrust is everywhere, and rightly so, I must sadly admit. The experiences described are only examples of a series of other experiences that are closely linked to privileges, or rather the lack of these. A knowledge of this mutual empathy is a precondition for the development of a ground on which something like the so-called eye-to-eye encounter can develop in the first place. We are dependent on listening to each other, on learning from each other if we want to design alternative futures. This requires the more privileged to include in their reflections not only what is obvious to them, but also to think about positions and perspectives that have not yet been part of their experiences. Thinking about privilege is not about guilt and atonement, but about balance. Besides, privileges are not fixed, but fluid and depending on context. If the context changes, our privilege changes. Some more than others, but this is a good thing, and it must be seen as a creative source because it is only in this process that encounter, exchange, and relationships are possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marit, and I will immediately hand over the mic to Imara. Imara Limon is a curator of contemporary art at the Amsterdam Museum. Her recent exhibitions include Monuments of Regions, Natasha Kensmill, 2020-2021, and Colonial Stories, Work in Progress from last year. In 2017, Imara developed the multi-year program New Narratives for Advancing Equity in the Museum. She has held an advisory position in arts funds and served on the board of Kunsten 92, the association representing the interests of the artistic, cultural heritage and creative sector in the Netherlands. She's on the board of trustees of Centraal Museum Utrecht and currently curating the biennial manifestation Refresh Amsterdam with the theme War and Conflict. And last but not least, she's working on a double exhibition with the Museum of the City of New York regarding 400 years of Dutch colonization. Dear Mara, the floor is yours. And before you start, you can come up already. We are a bit, we will have not so much time for discussion in the end. So I'm already saying now, when EMYA is finished, we will kind of have one round of debate amongst us and then opening the floor to the audience. So please already, while you listen to EMYA, think about questions, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Please, EMYA.
Thank you so much, first of all, for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here and very inspired. So my name is Imara Limon. I'm a curator at the Amsterdam Museum. I see that there are hopeful changes in the European cultural field in terms of dealing with colonial legacies. From exhibitions about colonialism to training programs for museum staff. But in a time of growing right-wing political parties and racist ideologies, an urgent issue is, how can we make these changes sustainable? I'll try to formulate an answer to this probing question by offering a close reading of my own curatorial practice at the Amsterdam Museum and share with you some insights as well as failures, some of the practicalities of how we do our daily work, what we encounter, what goes wrong as well, because this is necessary in order to do better. I always knew that exclusion and racism had to be acknowledged in order for it to change. However, I had become accustomed to hiding how institutional racism affects me personally on a daily basis, whether it was as an art student at university, as a young professional in the art world, or the small town that I grew up in. So I made it my mission to continuously make space for different perspectives within the museum, not just by speaking about my experiences, but also those of many other people whose stories are marginalized. So this is the Amsterdam Museum and the other location that we're temporarily in while renovating. I won't go into that. To give an example, I started as a freelance curator and did the show Black Amsterdam in 2016. Oh, this is the new building now. Where I did the show Black Amsterdam, it was 2016. An exhibition about Black presence and role models in the city, and about the term Black. What did it mean in our context? We did an open call for nominations and asked, which Amsterdammer inspires you? And one of the wall texts was about the museum being a white institution, obviously, I thought. But with a statement like this, I wanted to emphasize that the museum is not a neutral space. And we had disagreements about the term white institution behind the scenes, even though I think 90% of the staff was white at that time, and the Amsterdam Museum belongs to a city with a comprehensive history of slavery and colonial profiteering from all over the world. But the stories that are embedded in the collection still generally represent a white perspective and dominant narratives of wealth, power, and tolerance. So a year later, I initiate the ongoing New Narratives program that still runs today. And the program is about collaborating always with people who are not affiliated with museums and whose perspectives are underrepresented. So it consists of tours, talks, co-curated exhibitions, collection research, and more. And our focus was initially on colonial histories and legacies, but always immediately intersecting with overlapping struggles. Through broadening the networks of the museum, we aim to become a reflection of those networks in terms of staff, programs, and the stories that we tell. And one of the programs was guided tours by people who we asked to share their critical view of permanent presentations, temporary exhibitions, anything they would encounter in our spaces. What would they change, we asked. During these tours, the radical shift and tension that was in the air at that time in society, and still is, by the way, was also tangible in these spaces that we walked through. I underestimated it, how unsettling these conversations could be, and tour guides, for example, talking about feeling excluded by the frequent use in wall text of the terms we and us, implying white Dutch people and their ancestors, versus they, referring to the so-called other. They were being accused of being too sensitive, and I have many, many more examples. Some of the confrontations became verbally hostile. And from all these learnings, I thought, okay, Now we can expect results. There are people in our spaces telling us what wall text could be, how audio tours could be more inviting, and within the choice of which objects do we put on display. After all, my colleagues couldn't stop talking about the need for a multiplicity of voices. However, in practice, it proved to be quite a challenge. And later I realized that museum staff in charge of exhibitions, that was not me at that time, they were very interested in hearing all these other perspectives, but so reluctant to take these perspectives seriously. It was crucial for them that the process remained free of any obligations and to sustain the comfortable and secure position as gatekeepers. In fact, the team of curators and collection staff in charge of daily affairs around the permanent collections was the Vaste Opstellingscommissie, or the Permanent Collections Committee, abbreviated as the VOC, widely known as the Dutch East India Company. And this established power is what the gatekeepers perhaps subconsciously associated themselves with. And I was about to become part of this team, and it felt so uncomfortable and frustrating that they were just laughing it off when I mentioned it during a meeting. I remember that so well. But this was 5 years ago, and I'm optimistic. It took several years and key projects to achieve significant results that changed the narratives about Amsterdam. In the first year of the program, it was so emotionally intense for all of us, everyone involved. I felt seen for my expertise, but also frustrated and exhausted, because there was no concrete plan for actually becoming more inclusive or to hire more people of color in my department. And change takes time, but arguments like people are not ready, they need some time to adjust, once again centered the experiences of white people. But since then, there were what I consider several turning points. A collaboration between the then newly founded grassroots organizations, the Black Archives and the Amsterdam Museum in 2017, brought out a power dynamic that revealed several institutional blind spots. The Black Archives planned for their very first exhibition and invited me as a curator. The exhibition we curated, Black and Revolutionary, the story of Hermine and Otto Huiswoud, regarded the Huiswouds, a couple from British Guiana and Suriname who fought against colonialism and capitalism early in the 20th century. It was installed in a monumental building on Zeeburger Dijk, from which they waged their struggle, along with many intellectuals worldwide, and where the Surinamese society has now been based for over 100 years. I was so shocked to find out about that because I lived very close to it and I didn't know that this history had been there. So museum colleagues were a bit also enthusiastic but also very concerned about the quality of our upcoming project, that it would not meet institutional requirements. Persistent beliefs were that the topic would be too niche, that the Black Archives needed our professional help with text, object preservation, archiving, marketing tools for visibility, and more. But I believe it was not so much an offer as a control mechanism. Established white institutions have power and resources and tend to consider themselves more competent than grassroots organizations or community initiatives. The Black Archives were not interested in most things the museum proposed and offered, and that led to outrage. I functioned as a mediator between both organizations, and assumptions that were made really affected me, such as the subtle microaggressions of being overly surprised that the exhibition was inspiring, that it was well-researched, that it looked good, and that we had a budget that was fully crowdfunded by the community. These are some images and art projects that were in the exhibition. I should have seen the spaces before. It was really a storage space where nothing was happening but was completely transformed. There was so much bias that remained unacknowledged, and I realized this was what the project was about. Learning from that, I realized that marginalized voices could only be amplified through the museum if the power balance would shift, and if these voices and their needs would be valued as a part of our core mission, instead of merely considering the benefits or the risks for the institution. So this collaboration later became a key point of reference within the museum for reflecting on our own position in relation to smaller initiatives and grassroots organizations. Another major turning point for me was in September 2019, when we did a new narratives project that would spark a public debate around the term Golden Age. The museum's semi-permanent exhibition, Portrait Gallery of the Golden Age, consisted of over 20 large-scale 17th and 18th century Dutch masters that filled up this large room. And the whiteness of the city was portrayed in the regents, archers, merchants that were represented, that represented Amsterdam as merely a center of wealth, powerful families, and mostly men. Colonialism, through the lens of violence and enduring societal inequalities, was just not really there. And this absence is not okay in a time where people are fighting for their lives, for their jobs, and just to exist in spite of racism. So we commissioned an artistic project by Jurgen Chonafong. So I don't know if I mentioned, I'm a curator of contemporary art. Of course, we have collections ranging from all kinds of materials and time periods, but contemporary art is what I focused mostly on. So he guest curated Dutch Masters Revisited, 13 large photos of prominent Dutch people posing as black people in the 17th and 18th century Amsterdam who actually existed, also in large size, and they were displayed among the Dutch masters. And it created a strong contrast, really an awareness. And it was finally time to no longer use the term Golden Age as a synonym for the 17th century. We didn't figure this out ourselves. This was because of community pressure. We knew this already a long time, but this was the moment, this intervention in the space, to change also the exhibition title of Portrait Gallery of the Golden Age to Portrait Gallery of the 17th century. Still, it caused some tension within the museum. Many colleagues felt overwhelmed with the consequences because there was a media outrage. Immediately after the announcement, it was extensively discussed in the media for days, from newspapers, talk shows, the radio, even internationally in the New York Times. And the Dutch Prime Minister immediately responded within hours that it was nonsense and he was actually proud of our Golden Age. With new narratives, I was striving for change within the museum. However, our statement evoked a public debate on the national level, and terminology was the point of departure, but discussions finally varied from debating the meaning of the Dutch identity to questioning the freedom of speech, and we received a lot of hateful and threatening messages, but also a lot of support and a lot of slow processes of coming to terms with the colonial past on a broader level. So I consider this a major turning point, not only for the museum, but for the Dutch field in general. We were finally able to contribute to, no, this is the previous page, to contribute to change, as these topics around colonial legacies were often still discussed in the margins of society. So where are we now? To what extent has new narratives sparked change in museum in terms of how we deal with colonial histories and legacies? I think one of our learnings is around working with marginalized voices. How we now aim to collaborate from a place of reciprocity, and how to do it in a way that benefits an existing struggle. We are learning still to clearly define our role within each situation, for example, as facilitators, sometimes as connectors, sometimes mediators, or only as listeners who aim to learn. And my colleagues are also working on, could say not a manual, but a manual for ourselves, as working around this in different projects with different examples. And another lesson is to be more precise about terminology. The so-called Golden Age is merely one example, a golden age for some people, but not for others. And these perspectives are all valid and they all coexist, but what does it mean to whom and what are the effects on people today? So we have more conversations around that. The tours are still ongoing and divided into female gaze tours, queer gaze tours, decolonial gaze tours, and it is not a given. It could just change tomorrow if there's another relevant topic that comes up. A first step to becoming more self-reflective was our recent exhibition, Colonial Stories, Work in Progress, for which we investigated the many ways in which the city and our collection are still interconnected with colonialism. It revealed several areas to further research in the future, such as the provenance research on ivory objects and jewelry, colonial terminology used in the context of fashion and textiles. And some of the museum's developments have contributed significantly to telling more inclusive narratives. For example, although the museum is still predominantly white in terms of staff, it is more culturally diverse, and themes and issues that we address, partners that we work with, the expertise that we aim to bring in through guest curators, research teams, advisors. There is now never one curator for a project. It's always a curatorial team consisting of people from different departments, people who don't work in the museum, and they make their decisions together under our artistic and general leadership of two amazing women that lead our museum. We have ongoing collaborations and projects regarding colonial legacies, from research on our fashion collection to dialogues with indigenous communities in New York City regarding the Dutch invasion 400 years ago. And we commission contemporary artists and makers to critically reflect on urgent issues in society for exhibitions like the Golden Coach and the biennial exhibition Refresh Amsterdam that I'm now working on. So we do a lot of things, and I mentioned only a small fragment of it. But it's about what is behind those initiatives, what do we learn from it? And I hope to see these changes in an actual decolonization of museums, because I realize it's a process, we're not there yet. Perhaps it will never happen, but as long as the museum exists, we do have the responsibility to offer audiences access to information about ideologies that have been purposefully created at some point, rather than solely reproducing those ideologies. So to round up, in Colonial Stories, we scratched the surface of the museum's institutional history around dealing with colonialism. We examined exhibitions from the 1960s, or even in the past 10 to 20 years, and it became so clear that even though we do represent more inclusive narratives about the city today than a few years ago, it is not a linear process at all. Most important for the future is that we hold ourselves accountable. And don't become too optimistic, I mostly tell myself that. And to also keep asking questions, and what is our institutional responsibility today regarding inequalities in the broadest sense? And what does it mean for a white institution to commit to decolonization? The end. Thank you.
Could you turn up the mic, please? I do have a loud voice, but yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much to the three of you. And you addressed like both the structural issues, what is needed in this so-called decolonization as a process, as you just said, Imara. But also, how is this linked? How do we need to invest in structural change in order to be able to create other stories? And the question of, and then again, is who are the we? Who is the we are talking about? We have about 10 minutes because we started late, and I don't want to ask a question myself, because then we will run the risk that in your replies we will not have the chance to for the audience to ask their questions. We did have two really great meetings ahead of this panel, and I think you can all relate very well also to what the others are doing and have been talking about. So any question that will come, I think you will all be able to address and also address what has been said in the previous presentation. So let me just open the floor right away. If there are any questions to either Imara, Sandra, or Imara, or all the three of them, please. Otherwise, I would like to. Yes, is there? Yes, please, Marianne, in the back. Is there a mic in the audience? No mic in the audience? Okay, I'm gonna run and give you mine.
I just have a small remark that it was extremely interesting and extremely important topic what we are discussing at the moment. I just wanted to make a small remark that when we are talking about this issue, at the moment we are talking about it from the point of view of a Western European approach. But maybe it would be a more larger approach when we add also this Eastern European approach. And when we're talking about, for example, what happened also in Eastern Europe, social colonialism, Russian colonialism, what about the small nation and in eastern part of Europe? These are also all together, actually, when we are talking about colonization and decolonization. So just a remark, when we are, maybe it's important not to stay in this point where you are in between black and white, but to talk about it in a much larger scale. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I'm going to respond to that. This is why museums are places of power, because we have collections from around the world. It's also why I do not do single ethnicity work in museums when we're doing community engagement work. It's people from different geographical backgrounds, people who've had different experience of the impact of structural racism growing up in a place like Scotland. So there's people from around the world who have settled, migrated, some are second generation. So I agree with your point, and nothing is all black and white, but anti-blackness is actually a reality in the world. So we also have to acknowledge that when we're doing this work.
Okay. There is somebody waving their hands. Yes, Sharon, please. Sharon Heel.
Thanks to the panel for an absolutely brilliant discussion, debate and exploration of your work. How do we stop the work around decolonisation becoming extractive and using the emotional labour and actual intellectual labour of people of colour? What are the mechanisms that you have employed in your work?
For me, the most important thing was to start with looking at organizational structure, hiring process, how we do this. So I talked about program mostly and my own frustrations, but also about what there's also behind it is structural change in policies, from what you collect to how to hire more diverse staff, which for us meant changing the committees, but also the entire process. We experimented with, how do you say that, where you don't see who is applying, but people only answer some questions. Not sure if that's the entire answer, but to figure out what are different methodologies for that, and to make explicit which bias that we feel, to make it explicit so that it's not under the table and we also, oh, it's not a good candidate. So we make explicit that, oh, because of this answer, we think that this person might or might not do that. And then it's there, and then we say, oh, is that a problem? Or is it just something that could add to what we already know? And does this person have other qualities? Something like that. Maybe for me, it's important to not be the only one the whole time. And to, yeah.
And probably in addition, because when Sandra was speaking about being the curator of discomfort, I had the idea of what about like implementing something like a curator of comfort? Because, yeah, creating discomfort is of course very important, but like a museum is for many people already is a place of discomfort. And yeah, it's a bit weird because like curator comes from curare and care, and this is all in the word, the idea, but it was like about the collections and not the people. So maybe what happens if the focus shifts more to the people and we have like curators who really care and are curators of comfort?
I think what's interesting about that and that title, Curator of Discomfort, when we play around with the notions of what is a curator, and my understanding has always been curators are take care of objects and belongings. So the curator of discomfort takes care of people, the people in the institutions who have to be pushed through the discomfort of exactly what your question is meaning, I guess, Sharon, because it's not about consistently exploiting the knowledge and labour of people of colour. It's about learning, upskilling on racial literacy, but also it's not an add-on. This work is not something that we're all the experts. I mean, I find the idea of being called an expert is another way for the system to negate their responsibility in this work. You know, all the information's out there.
Maybe to add as a question, and also picking up on what Nanette said in her keynote, and Marit, you have raised this, the notion of decolonizing has also become something of a lip service by many. So how do you, you know, what Sharon asked about this extractivism of having those interventions as an also emotional labor, as an investment, and challenging the institution. At the same time, the institution is kind of thriving on this criticism that they're putting out in their own favor. How do you deal with this? And you termed the decolonization. I mean, it is, I think, very telling, and I found it really important to hear from all three of you, like how you invest in your different practices, you know, to make clear this is a process and this involves all of us. It is not only by some, it involves all of us, and it involves the notion of, as you said, Marit, you know, taking care of things that go unseen so often. What does it involve to invite people, to make them comfortable, and how is this maybe based on other people's necessary discomfort? So maybe one question to all three of you. The notion of discomfort seems irritating to some at first, but it seems so necessary, and it maybe is also the basis to make institutions not only places to learn, but to unlearn in order to create different kinds of stories.
I think the care does not only apply to guests from outside, elsewhere, other countries, other continents, also to the people who work there. And I kind of like, it is true and not true if people say that they don't find black people or people of color who want to work in the institutions. It's, yeah, sometimes it's kind of true because there might not be that many, because like the gatekeeper process like starts somewhere early on, that people, maybe younger people, don't even have the idea of being a curator or museum director or work in these kind of institutions. So it needs to be like looked at way like earlier steps. And then, yeah, also the institution itself is like, okay, so why should I work there? It's like, okay, so maybe there is it's not, like personally speaking, I get some job offers, and then sometimes I'm like, no, actually I don't want to do this. Because it's like, maybe it's a nice job, but it's like, where is the institution in like, within their own process? And do I really want to engage in this? Because we also talked about this yesterday, like for us, the work often is that before we can start the work we're doing, we have to create the environment that we can work in first. So there's always like these two, like it's a double work. And then so, of course, we look at the institution. Okay, so is this a good environment? How much do I have to invest before I can even start to do my work? And what do I get in return, in a way? So this is also like part of decolonization in a way, not only to talk about objects from colonial context, because they are like people and institutions and structures from colonial context that still are working today.
Yes.
Yeah, for me, I do see and recognize also a lot of fear and hesitation about saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong things, making the wrong programs, triggering people, not being welcoming. And yeah, we've been looking at what makes a difference between feeling welcome and not feeling safe or welcome in an institution. And we concluded that it's not so much about the things that you do, but also the intention of becoming a more healthy institution, the way that people are addressed when they have a complaint or when they say, don't feel comfortable. It's not the discomfort itself that makes it bad, but it's also how it's handled. And I think we've developed into a more healthy institution where there is space for that, and there is space for making mistakes on different sides. And it's one thing to encounter something that's really offensive, but the moment that it becomes a really big problem is when people say, oh, whatever, too bad for you. But if we are really shocked if we encounter something like, oh, we didn't know that, terrible, it shouldn't have happened, we change it tomorrow. And that has been difficult, but I feel that that should be the main attitude of a healthy institution, of decolonizing, to be flexible and to don't say like, oh, we are not in charge of that, it's always been like this, but to really have a different attitude. Yeah, I think that would make me feel more safe. Yeah.
I think it's about taking responsibility. I don't really like the term decolonization, because while we are sitting here right now, there is people who are currently being colonized, most notably First Nations people in Australia as we speak. So I don't really know if actually it is possible to decolonize, but I do think it's possible to create a changing museum, one that is value-based, you know, and thinks about society and humanity in a different way than it has done before. And I think, back to the thing about exploitation, and, you know, it's not about replicating the system of colonization with another form of colonization. So it's not, you know, obviously there is a real need to have diversity of thought, diversity of people. You know, all of that has to happen within our organisations, but it's not a tokenistic thing either. There's no point in replacing people who are all white with all of a sudden replacing them with people who are not all not white. That's not what's being asked here. You know, it's also about thinking about, well, the employment, for instance. What is it that is the standard requirement to be a curator? Maybe that needs to change. You know, I'm a curator and I have absolutely no museum background whatsoever. Does that answer that question? Right, good.
And there will be many more questions, but not now, unfortunately. Thank you so much, and there will be more possibilities to talk with you during the day and this evening. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to the three of you, Marit, Sandra, EMYA.